Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I wanted to take this topic, constantly asked, and there was research brought forward regarding it. So I wanted to read it, inshallah. It is the topic of eating in restaurants that music is played in the background. And also, which يتفرع منه, what branches from it is various of other topics, such as what's the ruling in working in a place where music is played in the background. So this and other topics that relate to it, such as going to a store for grocery where music is played in the background. So Islamically, we want to understand it from an academic point of view. So first come first, we want to explain the difference between as-sama' wal-istima', the difference between hearing something by chance, بغير قصد, and you hearing something without intention to do so, and istima', which is giving your ear intentionally to hear it and to listen. So with this, we have some statements of our ulama, past and present. I'll start with a contemporary scholar. There then I'll take ourselves back to some of the past scholars so we can see how it correlates, inshallah, in words. Barakallahu fikum.
قال وإذا سمعوا اللغو أعرضوا عنه. إذا سمعوا يجب أن نعرف الفرق بين سمع واستمع. فالسامع هو الذي أدرك الصوت بدون قصد، والمستمع هو الذي أدركه بقصد، أدرك الصوت بقصد. ولهذا نقول.
So the Shaykh is explaining the difference between sama' and istima'. One is trying to do so with intention, and the other one doesn't intend, however he happens to hear it.
يسمى سجود التلاوة لمن؟ للمستمع دون السامع. المستمع دون السامع.
And he correlates this topic to when a person is coming across some verse of prostration. If the one listens, who's beside him listens, then it's upon him to do sujood as well, alongside the one who recited it, but not the one who just heard, who happened to hear beside him, and he was not intentionally trying to listen to the recitation.
فهنا قال إذا سمعوا اللغو دل على أن هؤلاء القوم ليسوا يستمعون إليه ولكن يسمعونه.
So what the Shaykh is putting forward is that the righteous إذا سمعوا اللغو أعرضوا عنه, when they hear idle speech, even though they didn't intend to listen to it, they averted and turned away. And this is something that they were praised for. طيب, now we wanted to share some words of Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah from Majmu' al-Fatawa, where he says, الأمر والنهي إنما يتعلق بالاستماع لا بمجرد السماع. He says, commandment and prohibition only relates to, or is connected to, the affair of listening, not merely hearing. And he gives examples with that in Majmu' al-Fatawa. Also, he has other words where he says, وَأَمَّا مَنْ سَمِعَ مَا يُنَاسِبُهُ بِغَيْرِ قَصْدٍ فَلَا بَأْسٍ فإن النهي إنما يتوجه إلى الاستماع دون السماع. So he mentions that the prohibition is mainly relating to those who listen, not to those who hear. And he says, ولهذا لو مر الرجل بقوم يتكلمون بكلام محرم لم يجب عليه سد أذنيه. He says, for this reason, if a man were to pass by people speaking unlawful speech, it wouldn't be wajib onto him to put his fingers in his ears. لكن ليس له أن يستمع من غير حاجة, but it's not befitting for him to listen without any need. ولهذا لم يأمر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم ابن عمر بسد أذنيه لما سمع زمارة الراعي لأنه لم يكن مستمعا بل سامعا. And then he gives examples where the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did not command Ibn Umar regarding speech that was heard of unlawful speech from a shepherd, but because he wasn't listening, he was merely hearing. Also Ibn Rajab, in his book Nuzhatul Asma', he mentions similar words that Ibn Umar لم يكن مستمعا بل سامعا. Then he says والسامع من غير استماع لا يوصف فعله بالتحريم لأنه من غير قصد منه. So he mentions the prohibition mainly applies for the one listening, not the one who hears, because it's done without an intention. And he says وإن كان الأولى له سد أذنيه حتى لا يسمع. And he said even in that scenario, it's more deserving for him to put his fingers in his ears so he doesn't hear. This is what he mentions, and from the angle of what is more of a wara', of cautiousness, and more deserving. Also Ibn Qayyim, in his book Al-Kalam ala Mas'alat al-Sama', where he says وأما كونه لم يأمر نافعا بسد أذني عنده فلأن المحرم إنما هو الاستماع والإصغاء لا السماع من غير إصغاء واستماع فلا يجب على الإنسان سد أذنيه عند سماع الأصوات المحرمة وإنما الذي يحرم عليه قصد استماعها والإصغاء إليها أو قصد استماعها والإصغاء إليها. So he mentions the similar speech of what was mentioned by other scholars of Ibn Rajab and Ibn Taymiyyah, that what is wajib is to put your fingers in your ears when you are listening, not for merely hearing it. Also, from the words that we wanted to share, some words of Ibn Qudama al-Maqdisi, where he says, وَالْمُسْتَمِعُ هُوَ الَّذِي يَقْصُدُ السَّمَاعَ. And the one who's listening is the one who intends to hear. And also he mentions the story of Ibn Umar. So he mentions similar speech of Ibn Taymiyyah and also Ibn Qayyim and Ibn Rajab. So now we want to take some of the verdicts of the contemporary scholars regarding this. But before that, I want to share the story of the Jariyatain, the two female slave women, the young women that were singing in the presence of the Prophet ﷺ. Shaykh Islam Ibn Taymiyyah says, وَلَيْسَ فِي حَدِيثِ الْجَارِيَتَيْنِ أَنَّ النَّبِيَّ صلى الله عليه وسلم استمع إلى ذلك. He says, there's no proof in the hadith that the Prophet ﷺ was listening to that. And he mentions, same affair, that it's the ruling and prohibition applies mainly to those who are listening, not to those who are merely hearing. So we're going to here share a verdict of Shaykh Salih Fawzan regarding this topic, inshallah.
بعض الناس يذهب إلى مطاعم توجد فيها موسيقى ويقول أنا لا أتعمد سماعها وإنما أنكرها في قلبي وأتناول الطعام هنا.
So the questioner posed that some people go to restaurants where music is played, and these people that go say they don't intend to listen, rather they're merely disliking it with their heart and eating the food there. So the questioner says, is it permissible?
هل يجوز له ذلك؟
الإنكار بالقلب ما يكفي، لا بد من الإنكار باللسان. الإنكار باليد هذا لأصحاب السلطة، الإنكار باللسان هذا للعلماء والذين عندهم معرفة بأن هذا منكر. إذا لم يستطع هذا وهذا ينكر بقلبه ويعتزل مكان المنكر، أو ينكر بقلبه ويجلس في مكان المنكر يعتزل. نعم.
So the Shaykh mentions that if he's not capable of disliking it further than that, just with his heart, then, and this is a summarized answer to the Shaykh, it's not upon him to just merely say I dislike it and then remain there, but he should dislike it with his heart and try to isolate himself from it. So what being mentioned is that if he were to change it with his hand or critique it with his tongue, then it will be okay for him. But for him to just say dislike it with his heart and sit there, then this is what the Shaykh is pointing at. So we'll take other verdicts, inshallah.
أبو حمد يقول أكون خارج السعودية أحيانا وأدخل مطاعم تشغل أو تشتمل على موسيقى وصوت الموسيقى مرفوع، وإذا يعني نبهتم على ذلك قد يكون في إحراج أو مشقة أو مشكلة، فهل يكفي إنكاري بالقلب؟ من المعلوم.
طيب, so here's a question posed to Ar-Rakban, who was one of the previous members of Lajnat al-Da'imah. He was asked about that a person, when he's traveling outside of the country of Saudi Arabia, he happens to go to restaurants where there's music played, and he says somewhat of ihraj, where it becomes such a burden to ask them to turn it off. So is it permissible to eat in those restaurants where music is being played?
من المعلوم أن الإنكار درجات باليد، إن كان الإنسان ذا سلطة بالإنكار باليد، ثم إذا لم يكن ذلك ممكنا لكونه ليس بذي سلطة فيكون باللسان ثم بالقلب. فإذا كان في مثل الحالة التي وصفها أنه لا يستطيع أن ينكر بيده ولا بلسانه، وأنه يعلم أن ذلك غير مجد، فيرجى أن يكون الإنكار بالقلب كافي، لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وضع الدرجات الثلاث: من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده، فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه، فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه. نعم. وذلك أضعف الإيمان. بارك الله فيكم وأحسن إليكم. شبكة.
طيب, so the Shaykh, he answers, he says, what is known is that inkar, disliking and disapproving the evil, is of levels with your hand, for those who have the authority to do so, and then also with your tongue, he mentioned. And he says if the person is, as he mentioned, that he's not capable to do one or the other, and he sees that it's also not beneficial, it's not going to benefit if he were to do one of the two, and he were to dislike with his heart. And he says here we see that there's no harm upon the person, because the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that when disliking an evil, he mentioned the three levels. So he says from this point, it will be no harm, inshallah. So we wanted to share a verdict of Sheikh Saad Khatlan regarding this topic.
هذا يقول كثرة مطاعم الموسيقى، هل يجوز للأكل في هذا المطعم؟ علما أني أنكر ذلك. ما دمت تنكر ذلك، فإذا أكلت من هذا المطعم فلا حرج عليك، لأن الذي يأثم هو المستمع دون السامع. والفرق بين المستمع والسامع أن المستمع هو الذي يقصد الاستماع للأغاني، والسامع هو الذي يسمع الأغنية من غير قصد. وهذا مر نظيره في سجود التلاوة، أنه يشرع للمستمع دون السامع. المستمع هو الذي يقصد الاستماع للتلاوة، السامع هو الذي يسمع التلاوة من غير قصد ولا إنصات. فإذا كنت سامعا ولست مستمعا لهذه الأغاني فلا حرج عليك إذا قمت بواجب الإنكار.
So the Shaykh was asked about nowadays that restaurants have music in them, Is it allowed to eat there while disliking it? So the Shaykh says, being that you are critiquing it or criticizing it or doing inkar, and there's no harm to eat there. Because he says there's a difference between listener and the one merely hearing. And he mentions the example of sujood tilawa. So the summary of his answer is that it's permissible to eat there as long as you are doing the act of inkar. And he didn't specify what type of inkar, with the hand or with the speech or with the heart. He just merely mentioned inkar, as long as you are. So the Shaykh was asked about restaurants nowadays that play music there. Is it okay to eat there while disliking it or doing inkar? The Shaykh says, as long as you're doing inkar, it's permissible to eat there, because there's a difference between a listener and one who is hearing. And he gives the example of also sujood tilawa. He says permissible as long as you do inkar to eat there. I didn't mention specifically what type of inkar, if it's with the hands or with the tongue or with the heart. So you move on to another verdict, inshallah.
لكن تتخللها الموسيقى وبعض المنكرات، فهل الإخبارية وغيرها لا برامج مفيدة؟ ثاني للأخ عبد الله. وأيضا فضيلة الشيخ سؤال ثاني للأخ عبد الله، يقول أحيانا بعض البرامج مفيدة كالبرامج الإخبارية وغيرها، لكن تتخللها الموسيقى وبعض المنكرات، فهل يعفى عن ذلك؟
So the Shaykh is asked about when watching some of these programs, within them there's some music being played. So he says, is there any sin watching these programs, Shaykh? Asking Shaykh Salaf Fawzan.
الشيء غير المقصود أنت لا تقصدها ولا تتلذذ بها، أنت قصدك الأخبار فتستمع إلى الأخبار. نعم.
So he says that's that which is non-intended and you're not finding enjoyment in it, then there's a difference. So it's no harm in listening to the akhbar, these news, these programs, because of this reason the Shaykh mentioned. And this is in brief a translation. So just to point out once again the difference between the one who's listening and the one who's merely hearing something, and you didn't initially intend to hear it. Yes, there are some scholars who hold a different stance. Such as Sheikh bin Baz, when he was asked, ما حكم استماع بعض البرامج المفيدة كأقوال الصحف ونحوها التي تتخللها الموسيقى. What's the ruling on listening to the beneficial programs or episodes, such as the news and journalism and the likes of it? What has music being played within them? So he says, لا حرج في استماعها والاستفادة منها. There's no harm of listening to it and benefiting from it. مع قفل المذياع عند بدء الموسيقى حتى تنتهي، لأن الموسيقى من جملة الآلات اللهو يسر الله تركها والعافية من شرها. So the Shaykh, from his fatwa, he mentions that there's no harm in listening to it and benefiting from the news, as long as you turn off the radio or the broadcasts when music starts to be played until it's off. Then wait till, like he mentions, till it's off. And he says, because music is from musical instruments, and he's asked Allah that it be abandoned and people be saved from his evil. Also, Shaykh Abdul Karim al-Khudayr was asked about episodes and programs that have music in them. He mentions not to listen if they're being played in the background. Also, Shaykh Albani, he says, أما الراديو فممكن التصرف فيه لكن بشرط السابق. وإذا سمعت الموسيقى فأوقفها مباشرة. واصبر إلى أن يأتي he says واصبر إلى أن يأتي وقت نشرة الأخبار. فإذا جاءت فاسمع الأخبار، ولا بد من سماع الأخبار في اعتقادها حتى يعرف المسلم الجو والمحيط والزمن الذي يعيش فيه. So he says, as for the radio, then you can have some flexibility with it, with the condition that you do what was previously mentioned, that if once you hear the music, you turn it off right away, he says, and be patient until the time the news comes in. Be patient until the news comes in, and then once the news comes in, then listen to the news. He says there's must to listen to the news, in my belief, until the Muslim can know the weather and his surroundings and what the climate and things that he's living in. طيب, so this is the advice of Sheikh bin Baz and Sheikh Abdul Karim al-Khudair, Sheikh Albani. Also, Lajnat al-Da'ima was asked about someone finding the need to go on these means of transportation that has music in there, where as a result he has to listen to these music things playing in the background, and even taxis. So the لجنة الدائمة says إذا كنت لا تستطيع منع الأغاني في الحافلة وأنت محتاج إلى ركوبها لبعد المسافة ولا تجد وسيلة غيرها فلا بأس عليك في ذلك مع إنكار المنكر حسب استطاعتك ولو في قلبك. So they mention that if you can have the capability to prevent the music being played in the bus, and you're in need of going in that bus and riding with it because of the furthest of the distance, and you don't find no other means, then he says there's no harm upon you as long as you are disliking that evil according to your capability, even if it be with your heart. And also they have another verdict where they were asked about sometimes the person hears music being played when he's on hold on the phone or with the airlines. So they say استماع الغنى لا يجوز وأما سماعه بدون قصد كما يعرض في الطريق أو التليفون فنرجو أن لا حرج. He says as for listening to music, it's not permissible. As for merely hearing it without any intention, as what may happen in the pathways or the phones, and we hope there will be no blame or no harm or sin in that affair. These are taken from Fatawa Lajnat al-Da'ima. Another last one we wanted to conclude with is what's the ruling on working in a place that music is played there in the background. By Sheikh Sulaiman Rahili.
يقول رجل يعمل في متجر كبير لكن فيه موسيقى لكن الصوت ليس بقوي وهو لا يستطيع أن يحذفها، ما نصيحتكم وهل يجوز العمل في مثل هذا المكان؟
أما التحريم فلا نستطيع أن نقول بالحرمة.
So the Sheikh was asked about a person working in a shopping area or business store, and there's music being played in the background. So is it allowed for him to work there? The Sheikh says, as for in terms of declaring it to be haram, then we cannot do that. We cannot say that it's haram.
ما دام أنه لا يضع الموسيقى ولا يرضى بها وقد عمت بها البلوى.
It's as long as he's not the one who placed the music, put it on, nor is he pleased with it, and it's something that have become overwhelming, where you cannot really find a place that doesn't have music. It's something widespread.
فلا تكاد تجد سوقا إلا وفيه هذه الموسيقى ولكن نقول
He says it's rare to find a market or a mall that doesn't have this type of music being played.
وجدت غيره لا تبتلى فيه بهذا الشر وبمزامير الشيطان فاخرج منه. أما كونك.
And he says, however, if you're able to find other than it, that's not being played of these instruments of the shaitan, then leave it. He says to go and find elsewhere.
لا تجد وهذا قد عمت به البلوى وأنت في نفسك كاره له فلا حرج عليك إن شاء الله.
So he says, if you don't find and you're already disliking it, and this is something widespread, then there's no sin upon you.
وهذا هو الذي يسميه العلماء بالتخفيف من أجل العسر وعموم البلوى.
So he mentions this is a qaida, that there's some sort of reduction and ease brought due to it, there being difficulty in avoiding something that has become widespread.
بحيث يعم البلاء ويصعب على الإنسان أن يتخلص منه. وأكثر الأعمال إنما هي في الأسواق، لكن إن وجدت غيره يحصل به الرزق والقوت وتسلم فيه من هذا البلاء فاخرج منه، واسعى في البحث لعلك أن تجد غيره مما لا تجد فيه ما يمرض قلبك ولا يحزن نفسك. أسأل الله أن يوفق الجميع لما يحب ويرضى، وفي هذا كفاية والله أعلم، وصلى الله على نبينا وسلم.
So the Shaykh once again repeats that if you find elsewhere that doesn't have this trial, then leave your position now and go to the other place where your heart is not exposed to sickening, nor does it bring sadness to yourself being there. So this is what he advised with, and he made dua. So in summary, what is the standard verdict nowadays regarding the restaurants? And some of the mashayikh were asked, هل يجوز أن أجلس في مطعم يوضع فيه الموسيقى أو الأغاني وهدفي ليس إلا الأكل فقط؟ Is it permissible for you to sit in a restaurant where music is being played or songs are being turned on, and my intention is only just the food there? Well, they have mentioned that لا يجوز الدخول في هذه الأماكن وأمثالها إلا بقصد الإنكار. It's not permissible to enter in these places and its likes except with the intention to have inkar, showing your disapproval. وإذا لم يجد إنسان غيرها وكان مسافرا والوقت ضيق فأكل منها وكانت حالته سماعا لا استماعا مع قيامه بالإنكار حسب قدرته فلا حرج عليه. وإن وجدت بدائل أخرى أو سعة في الوقت لم يجوز الدخول إلا بزوال هذا المنكر والله أعلم. So some of them have mentioned that a person doesn't find other than it and he's traveling and the time is tight and he ate there and his affair was merely hearing and not listening alongside doing inkar according to his capability, then there's no sin upon him. And if he finds other than it, or he finds time of searching for other, then he's not allowed to enter these places except with removing the munkar. So this has become the standard verdict that I've seen. And yes, there are some scholars who put it out that nowadays it's really hard to find a restaurant. And even if you do find a restaurant, while you're perhaps eating, they start to turn on the music. It becomes some sort of mashaqqa, difficulty. So every time, if you enter a restaurant and you happen to not hear music, and then in the middle of it, you find yourself having getting up after perhaps placing an order, waiting for the food. This could bring mashaqqa because we know ammat bihil balwa. That's overwhelming, especially in the Western countries, that a person tries his best to request from the person there, the owner, the waitress, to turn down the music and the likes of that, showing his disapproval. And if it were to occur that they don't turn off the music and you've shown your disapproval of it, then there's no harm upon the person in that case, especially if he finds it difficult. And we know the restaurants, how it is in the situation of these lands. And perhaps we have an udhr, an excuse with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the fact that we've shown our inkar. As we know, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, "Man ankara faqad salim, walakin man radiya wa taaba." And the one who shows his inkar or he has dislikeness to it, then he is safe. But the one who's pleased and goes forward with it and then follows into that, then yes, that is the sin. So we must also know the difference between leaving off something out of wara', cautiousness for oneself, and also in terms of what is Islamic ruling and these type of scenarios where people are overwhelmed, then what we can say is there's no sin upon these people, especially if this is the case of the people. If the people were to have wara and to go eat, perhaps take the food to go and to eat at home, and take that extra effort and so forth, and exert themselves in whatever they're doing to find a place as an alternative, then there's no harm for them. And that's perhaps, inshallah, we hope that is from the angle of wara, where they get rewarded for. But in terms of if people were to sit in these restaurants and they're disliking it and they've shown their disapproval, and they've seen that as perhaps this is the case where you probably leave one restaurant out to do the music, you go to another one, next door to it you find music, you go to the one down the street, you find music. You find yourself in every day in a certain type of pattern where it can bring a difficulty. So al-mashaqqa tajlibu at-taysir, with difficulty there's ease, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows the affair. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to ease our affairs and to bring this more awareness of Muslims of the evil of this affair. So our Muslim communities can make more restaurants for themselves and alternatives where we can be supporting the Muslims as a community and as a business, and have to not going to these other places.